I thought we were going to have the kitchen table, and as it happens, the book I wrote about my father, Messages from My Father, begins at a kitchen table. And I thought I'd start by reading the beginning of that book, just a few paragraphs, and then talk about that. The man was stubborn. Take the coffee incident. This happened after I was living away from home, working as a reporter in the South. I was back in Kansas City for a visit, and my father and mother and I were sitting at the kitchen table. My mother had just made coffee. After pouring a cup for me, she asked if I wanted some milk in it. I don't use milk, I said. Well, I'll tell you one thing, my father said. If you were blindfolded, you couldn't tell if there was milk in it or not. As it happened, my father had never tasted coffee in his life. Was he a Mormon? No, he was not a Mormon. A health nut? No. The only nutritional theory I can remember his propounding was that you couldn't gain more weight from eating something than the food itself weighed. So devouring a 1-pound box of intensely rich chocolate candy couldn't put on more than 1 pound. It stands to reason was how we usually introduced that theory, among others. Was he someone who had rare allergy to coffee beans or caffeine? No, he thought of allergies as the sort of affliction that cropped up among my mother's relatives, who apparently constructed elaborate defenses against illness, real and imagined, and were described around our house as nervous. He didn't drink coffee because at some point in his childhood he had sworn that he never would. My father had sworn off any number of things. As a young man, he smoked for a few years and then swore off cigarettes. He swore off liquor before he was old enough to taste any, supposedly because of his disgust at the smell of stale beer in the taverns where he sold newspapers as a boy. As far as I can remember, he never gave any specific reason for swearing off coffee. It may be that coffee just got caught up in the boyhood oath against liquor, tossed in because it was also something grown-ups drank. I think he also must have sworn off swearing. If you ran him out of patience, his strongest expression was, "For crying out loud." I sometimes imagined my father as swearing off things just to keep in practice. The sort of person who looks at himself in the mirror after shaving one day and for no particular reason says to the image he sees, "You have hit your last bucket of driving range golf balls." Or, "No more popcorn for you, young fella." The act of swearing off, in other words, seemed to overwhelm whatever had triggered it. It's possible, I suppose, that for over the years my father could have forgotten why he struck something off the rolls. In his case, though, forgetting what had been behind some absolute prohibition would not have been an argument for ending it. If he swore off something, it stayed sworn off. He had no need to offer explanations for the ban because it applied to him alone. He didn't harangue people about the wickedness of demon rum. I have no reason to believe that he thought it was wicked. He had nothing against anyone else's drinking coffee, including me. He wasn't questioning my ability to tell the difference between black coffee and coffee with milk as a way of telling me that coffee wasn't worth drinking. He spoke in a perfectly agreeable tone, as if he were passing on some interesting fact about coffee that he had just read in the Kansas City Star. I also spoke in a perfectly agreeable tone. I said, "Does it occur to you that as someone who has never tasted coffee, with or without milk, you may not be a great authority on this subject?" "I don't care what you say," my father said, using an opening phrase he often employed even if you hadn't said anything. Blindfolded, you wouldn't know if there was milk in it or not. This is stubborn. I read that partly because now that I read it, I realize it's what an old editor named Bob Bingham at the New Yorker used to call beginning in the middle, which he always said about John McPhee. John McPhee was able to begin a story in the middle. And I think what he meant was that he sort of got you going before he went back and told you exactly where everybody was born and who people were and what you were doing. But that's not why I read it. I read it because I thought I'd be sitting at the kitchen table, but also because after I had written this, or an earlier version of this, and some other things, I pretty much gave up writing the book on my father. Or at least I thought I had given it up. The way it came about was that I had written a book called Remembering Denny, which was about a classmate of mine at Yale, and the person we thought was going to be president. When I went back to Yale in 1970, I was talking to some undergraduates, and I asked if they had anybody they thought was going to be president, and they said, "President of what?" In the 1957 in Yale, you didn't have to ask of what. It was the United States, and he was sort of a hero. He was naturally a Rhodes Scholar, and he was a swimming team member and a very high in the class. And Life covered his graduation, which those of you who are my age understand was sort of the cultural impact of all three television networks covering your graduation. Alfred Eisenstadt came to photograph Denny's graduation. And then he committed suicide in the early 90s, and I wrote a book about him. I hadn't thought that my father was in the book, was going to be in the book, even though he had met Denny once at graduation, was always very impressed by him. Said he had $1 million smile. It's the sort of phrase my father used. And, but it turned out that my father was a big part of the book because Denny and I had both come from immigrant grandparents. His grandfather had been a Danish ship captain. And there are some parallels in the story, and my father became rather important. And my editor at Forrest, Strauss and Giroux, Jonathan Galassi, suggested that I write about my father. Jonathan Galassi is a very distinguished editor, and he's also a poet, and he's, in fact, I think the president of the Academy of American Poets. But since he has an Italian surname, we think he should have a mob nickname. So we call him Johnny G. But most people call him Jonathan Galassi. And I hesitated to do this because, for one thing, my father at that point had been dead for 30 years. And so my memories of him obviously had faded to some extent. And also, I hadn't spent as much time with him as some people spend with their fathers. He was a grocer for most of my childhood, and he got up at 4 in the morning every morning to go to the city market to get his produce. People sometimes ask him, well, I guess you get used to that, don't you? And he always said, no. He never, but he got up, and so obviously he was tired when he got home. And I never saw him in the sort of way some people saw their fathers, except on these trips that we used to take after the war. And I'd sort of written about them. My father in the front seat as we drove out west, pointing out the buttes and the mesas, and my sister and I in the back seat arguing over territory. I compared it to the a sort of geopolitical situation in the backseat with a border, sort of like the border between the old Soviet Union and Finland. And my sister, I was Finland. My sister was the Soviet Union, bristling weaponry. I'd written once about my father in I think meaning well, not realizing it was sort of a retrograde thing to do politically, had said something that was very damaging to my side. He said, "We do not hit girls. You will never hit your sister again." And my sister was not visited with a similar injunction. And so I became unilaterally disarmed Finland. And she became the Soviet Union, bristling with weaponry and not unafraid to use it. And I had written that if I hadn't had a sister with expansionist backseat policies, I would probably have grown up knowing the difference between a Butte and a Mesa, but I had to concentrate on my own problems in the back seat, pretty much. So that's mainly what I remember about those trips, was fighting with Suki, my sister, in the back seat. Also, there wasn't a lot of documentary material. I don't think he mentioned it last night, but I've heard Russell Baker speak about coming across this trunk full of letters that his mother had exchanged with a friend during the Depression, and what a kind of a wonderful spine it made to talk about the Depression. We had kind of moved houses a couple of times, and I didn't think I had any of that. Also, I had the same sort of problem that Eddie Harris had of the happy childhood problem. I don't think that Frank McCourt, when he was sort of looking for lumps of coal and half starved, was thinking, this is great material. But it was great material. I mean, it takes somebody who can see it through a child's eye and through a particular form of humor to make a book out of it. But I didn't have that. And I had the mindset, also kind of a Midwestern mindset, which is to say that I sort of liked everybody, and I didn't have the feeling in the East it's expected that you resent your father for sleeping with your mother, it's a sort of a psychoanalytic view of life, which we didn't have in Kansas City. And when people ask why everybody in Kansas City seems so stable, I always say there's a sign on the city limits that says, "Psychoanalysts, don't let the sun set on your ass in this town." But it's not just a matter of sort of actual psychoanalysis, but kind of way of thinking. The assumption that you hate your parents was not really widely believed in the Midwest when I was growing up, and I never believed it. And I didn't have any scores to settle. These new books about the New Yorker now that have come out, that I read them, I say, oh yeah, hates that person, likes that person. I didn't have any of that. And I had sort of mentioned, I had tried to kind of talk about the score to settle with my sister Suki. I wanted to, she told me to dedicate a book to her. And so I said, all right. I mean, I knew from a long time in the back seat what would happen if I didn't. And she said she wanted her full name because we have different last names because she got married, and I, not just my sister. And it's okay. So I dedicated a book, and I showed the rough draft of the dedication to Alice, and it said, "To my sister Suki, in a first tentative step toward forgiving her for trying to throw me down the laundry chute in 1937." Alice made me take the laundry chute thing out. said it wasn't very gracious. And said, attempted murder is not gracious either, right? And I didn't do any of that. Anyway, I pretty much settled my score, I think, with Suki. Also, I had a problem that's sort of like the happy childhood problem. Around the time I was thinking of writing this book about my father, a lot of the memoirs that had come out seemed to be about some horrible secret in the family, some hideous atrocity that had taken place, of incest or murder or something, or both and everything. And we just didn't have anything like that in my family. I had never actually heard my parents raise their voice to each other ever. And we got along pretty well, which is, of course, death for someone who was trying to write about this in those days, I thought. And of course, in the Midwestern way, even though this was an immigrant family, you pretty much think you're getting along well, even if you're not, because you don't analyze all this stuff and say no big deal. It's a Midwestern motto. And so in the book I wrote later about, I guess it was about rearing kids, Family Man, the last book I wrote, I talk about my fantasy of being in a sort of a hangout with a bunch of memoir writers, sort of like this, as a matter of fact, but they're talking about their various secrets and atrocities, and they look at me and I say, well, the only thing I can think of is Chubby the collie dog, and Chubby the collie dog. And let me tell the story. It's an absolutely true story that when I was 2 or 3, we had a little collie dog named Chubby, and he was kind of sickly. And at one point, my parents told Suki and me that they had taken Chubby and given him to some really nice friends who lived on a farm where he could be happy in the fresh air and sunshine with the other animals. And some years later, I think I was home from college for vacation. Chubby's name came up at the dinner table, and I said, whatever happened to old Chubby? You know, as I remember, we really never went out to visit him on the farm. And Suki looked at me, and so I started eating the mashed potatoes with my fingers or something. And she said, "That wasn't any farm." She said, "Chubby had to be put to sleep." And I said, "Chubby's gone?" I think my mother said that probably Chubby would be gone in any case, because collies don't usually live 18 or 20 years. And I said, but why am I just finding out now? And my father said, it's not our fault you're slow on the uptake. So this was about the worst family secret I could think of. And it really doesn't stand up against those other things. And also, I'm not sure that I would have said much about a family secret if I had one. Maybe. I was interested in the question to Russell Baker last night about whether it had to do with his generation, how much he said in the book. And I think it's true, as he said, that there was plenty of yellow journalism in those days. But as he also said, it was practiced by a certain number of narrow part of the society, and you didn't just sort of write a book about it, particularly if you weren't, say, a movie star or something. And in our families, we call that 50s guy view of life, which is sort of a need to know sort of view of life. People don't, if they don't need to know, you don't have to tell them. And as opposed to the total disclosure mode. And I know it's probably been a big argument over the week about how much is okay to say, particularly how much it's okay to say that's, I suppose you can say anything that's embarrassing to yourself, that's up to you, but for people who are still alive, whether it's something that would wound them or embarrass them even. And some people say, well, you can't really do that, it's not fair, they didn't know. I mean, it is true in our house occasionally when Alice and I are talking at dinner, and in a kind of way that after an embarrassing number of years of marriage, you do, and then I'll say to her, Alice, what you just said was not off the record. And so it's really not, it seems unfair to people who happen to be in the house where a writer also lives, or somebody who's going to be a writer someday, to have this. I took care of this with my, people asked me after I did the book on my father, you worried that your own girls, both of whom are very good writers, although they don't do it professionally, might write about you someday? And I said, no, it doesn't. I tell you, it doesn't bother me at all, because when they were about 5 and 8, I had them sign this standard non-disclosure agreement that I copied it off the one that Buckingham Palace employees or everything, and they wondered about it. I said, trust Daddy, just sign it. But it is a sort of a problem, and some people say, well, it's art, and you're a writer and you have to write it because it's art. And I think what's lost in this argument is the quality of the art. It seems to me to be based entirely on the quality of the art. Maybe if it really is art, then you do have a right, but if it isn't, you don't. And so I've actually discussed this, I think it was in Family Man, and I do what I call the Dostoevsky test. That if you have reason to believe that you're another Dostoevsky, then you have more than just a permission, but almost a duty to write things that might embarrass people. I mean, if the time your mother told you in a weak moment that she never really loved your father, even if that makes it kind of awkward in the retirement village, that your readers are going to want to know 100 years from now about that. So if you're Dostoevsky, you have the right to say anything, and if you're not, you don't. And we had, plus, you know, as I said, it was a regular family, mom in the kitchen, that sort of thing. That is lacking material, although it is true that I did realize at one point about my mom in the kitchen that for 30 years she had served her family nothing but leftovers. I was in college before I started to wonder, leftover from what? But at any rate, I had this regular family, and it's true that my father swore off things, and he was unusual in that he had a curse collection, for instance. I mean, most people's fathers collect something, like Toby mugs or matchbooks or something. My father collected curses. He liked Irish curses, but he was kind of a specialist in Yiddish, sort of, may you have an itch that's where it's impossible to scratch sort of curses. And he got a great one down here because he used to come to Florida. When he came to Florida, what he did mainly was he hung around, which is now Miami, South Miami Beach, trendy place, and then, when I liked it a lot better, frankly, were the sort of old boobies who had moved down from New York with limited income and resources, mainly consisting of real experience in arguing with the butcher. And he would hang around listening for arguments in the grocery stores and everything. Were wonderful. And he heard a woman say to a butcher once, "May you have an injury that is not covered by workman's compensation." Can you imagine a curse collector hearing that? And he was, to me, an interesting man, but after a summer in Nova Scotia, where we lived in the summer, where I'd written what I read for you and some other things, I really sort of gave it up because I thought, why would anybody be interested in reading a bunch of anecdotes about a grocer in Kansas City? And I think it was Bill Sheed who said a very wise thing, that writers usually sort of flail around and then at some point saying, oh, find the meaning of what they're writing, and then they may in the introduction give you the impression this is what they thought of the whole time. I think he said another wonderful thing, which was that at AA meetings, the boring talks were people saying how they felt, and the interesting ones were people telling stories. But at any rate, I think I finally realized at some point, and then what happened when I got back to New York in the fall, I looked pretty much at the stuff I just read you, and I sort of liked that opening. I just liked it I just liked the way it sounded, and I thought, well, I'll keep going on this for a while. And then I decided it actually was about something, that it was about, in the first place, the sort of person who seems like a regular person, but is actually an extraordinary person. And one of the extraordinary things is that my father sort of saw himself as a transition to me, which is a remarkable sort of leap of sort of suppression of ego, or whatever you want to call it, that he actually, his aspirations for me were that strong. And also, I realized that even though we never had these sort of heart-to-hearts that people have, or at least in the movies, I've never actually met anybody who had them, but where the father says, son, come into the study, I'd like to have a talk with you. We didn't have those. Somehow, he had passed on these messages to me, so that I knew in every situation, large and small, how my father expected me to behave, as a reporter, as a husband, as a father, and everything. That I knew all of this, and so I realized that the book was partly about how these messages get passed on, and also about some. And I, of course, as I wrote the book, I changed my view of what my childhood had been like. I have a chapter in the book where I talk about childhoods having themes, that if you listen to somebody talk about his childhood, you can usually detect a theme. The theme may be our family has a many generation of honorable life in this country and you must uphold the name, or something. That's a theme. Or we're miserable because your father deserted us. Is a theme, and usually there's a theme. And I had thought originally that the theme of my childhood was, we want you to have everything we didn't have, because my parents, and I think everybody they knew, grew up in modest circumstances. But then I later realized as I wrote the book, which was hard for me to see as a child, since we seemed just like everybody else and so American, that the real theme was, we want you to have everything we didn't have so you can be a real American. And I tried to figure out the theme that I wanted my daughter's childhood to have after they were already grown up. And I realized that what I had been working on kind of subconsciously, partly because of my father, and I associated where I came from so much with my father, was, and my girls grew up in Greenwich Village. that despite evidence to the contrary, you're being raised in Kansas City. And I thought I would end by reading a couple of, about 2 paragraphs about how that came through. This is in a scene in which I realized that I can actually realize the moment that I knew that the world did not take my father as all-powerful in the way I did. And I'm trying to explain why it didn't bother me the way in the novels it always bothers the guy in the red room. Also, I understood that my father, who in some ways seemed so Midwestern, had a strong sense that proper behavior was modest behavior, the sense that Midwesterners reflect when they respond to an expression of gratitude or admiration by saying something like, "No big deal." Even the words to live by that I have always associated most strongly with him, "You might as well be a Mensch," lack grandiosity. The German word Mensch, which means person or human being, can take on in Yiddish the meaning of a real human being, a person who always does the right thing in matters large or small, a person who would not only put himself at serious risk for a friend, but also leave a borrowed apartment in better shape than he found it. My father clearly meant for me to be a Mensch. It has always interested me, though, that he did not say, "You must always be a Mensch," or "The honor of this family demands that you be a Mensch," but "You might as well be a Mensch," as if he had given some consideration to the alternatives. I also knew that he had contempt for people who felt the need to pump up their own importance. I just heard a wonderful Irish phrase for that about somebody who was full of his wee self. I have to say that no writer has ever lost money by being full of his wee self, but that's a totally different subject. The phrase he used to describe that sort of person was big knacker. The Yiddish word knacker comes from the German word that means to crack. Apparently it referred originally to the boss who cracked the whip, and then evolved into a word that is more or less a derisive form of what Americans mean when they say big shot. My father used it to refer to people who boasted of their triumphs, or drove showy cars, or displayed signs of having absorbed the teaching of the Talmud on the blessedness of charity, without going on to read the section that says that the most blessed charity is the kind given anonymously. These were big knackers. The phrase has never left my consciousness. There have been occasions in New York when, for one reason or another, I have spent an evening in the apartment, always a luxurious, lavishly decorated apartment, of the sort of person who boasts about the art on the walls and drops a lot of names and makes sweeping pronouncements with an air of absolute infallibility. Going down in the elevator at the end of the evening, I can feel Alice looking at me. She knows what's going through my mind. I'm thinking about what my father's response to the evening would be. He would say nothing all the way down. As the elevator doors opened and we walked into the lobby, he would sum up the host in 2 words: big knacker. Thank you.